Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Nicola Twilley. Nicola is a science journalist who contributes regularly to the New Yorker, and she's also the co-host of the Gastropod podcast, which explores the intersection of science and food. And today we will speak about her book co-written with her husband, Jeff Maynaud, which is called Unto Proven Safe, the history and future of quarantine. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be on the show.
So we are coming out of the first pandemic that I have experienced in my lifetime, and the first time that I have been quote unquote under quarantine. So I'm full of questions. And of course, you're giving us a historic perspective of how quarantines have evolved throughout the ages and the future of quarantines. And I just cannot wait on to ask you a whole bunch of questions. But before that, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. So far, I know that you are a science journalist. Can you tell us from, let's say, 17 years old, you were trying to decide what to do with your life and you stumble upon this career that you have right now?
Oh, I wish I had stumbled across it that early. I grew up in England, and you're encouraged to specialize very early in the English educational system. And I was terrible at maths and science. So I was all languages, and history and English literature, art history. So entirely did not figure out my track in life until much later. And what I have discovered is that it's sort of fascinating to be a science journalist without a background in science, because it forces you to really understand there are no shortcuts. I ask all the stupid questions, but that way I'm meeting most people who also aren't scientists where they are, and we can all learn something that way. So it's a lot of fun because it's really unknown territory for me.
So you don't have what is called the course of knowledge. You have to approach subjects with the eyes of a person who doesn't know anything about the subject of expertise, the science.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I am coming at it as just a curious person, and I think it helps.
Okay, and then can you just also tell us one or two words about your podcast? Is food, science? What do you cover in your podcast?
Yeah, it's food through the lens of science and history. So we will take a topic, whether it be tipping, which is a huge topic in America, or whether it be a specific food like lobster, or I don't know, a food related thing like glass bottles. And we will look at the history and science of it. So everything from why tipping became sort of enshrined in US law to how glass bottles helped end child labor in the US, to the mysteries of figuring out how old a lobster is, and the very curious ways they go about reproducing. So we cover everything, the stories behind your food, I guess is the way we look at it.
Okay, so well, this is out of the scope of our interview, but one quick question about food. I'm vegan, and I wonder, when did veganism became popular? Because as far as I know, I am vegan because my ex-girlfriend talked me into becoming vegan, to be honest. But now I'm curious, when this came mainstream in our society?
I am so glad you asked, because we have the episode for you. We did a whole episode on the history of vegetarian and vegan diets, and also the science. So looking at, the sustainability aspects, the health aspects, but of course it goes way back. And depending on which culture you're looking at, whether you're looking at sort of the Indian subcontinent or Greek, there were various Greek philosophers who advocated reducing animal products or even removing them. So you can trace it back to a few different places in the history of humanity way back, and we do in the episode. So you should check that out.
I'm gonna check it out, and I will link to it in the show notes. Okay, then let's speak about quarantine. How this topic came about? You were I mean, as far as I know, you started this book long before our present quarantine. So, what inspired you?
It's a great question. When we started researching it, a lot of people thought it has to just be a historical book, because, you know, we're past the era of mass quarantine now. We have modern medicine, we have treatments, and we have vaccines, we have tests. We'll never need this kind of quarantine again. Even some experts said that. We went to the World Health Organization in Geneva, and, you know, the person we spoke to there said, well, we wouldn't really ever recommend a mass quarantine anymore. It's, you know, medicine has moved on. Some people saw it coming, some people didn't. By the end of our research, we really felt that we were entering a new era of quarantines. And it was amazingly timed. After doing all this reporting and traveling, and, you know, we traveled all around to see the origins of quarantine in the Adriatic and Mediterranean. We traveled all around the US and Australia, the UK, globally, to look at quarantine in different contexts and situations and different ways it's implemented. And then we get back, we're about to start writing, and lockdown happens. Which, let me tell you, is a great way to get a book written, because there was absolutely nothing else to do. So we just sat at home.
Unless you have kids.
That is true. Yes. And you're trying to homeschool them. Don't even. I have the hugest amount of sympathy for people who had to manage the past year with children. But yes, so that's how it, you know, we had come across quarantine. Actually, I think first in Australia. We were there for work, my husband and I, and family friend took us for a picnic near a former quarantine station that has been turned into a hotel. It's on a very beautiful, sort of the north head of Sydney Harbour, very beautiful location, you know, now a perfect place to get away from it all. And we wondered, you know, what was this thing that left ruins all around the world, you know, usually in beautiful locations, because they had to be slightly far away from the city, on an island or a peninsula. What was the history of this? And then, of course, as we started looking into it, we realized, oh, it's not over, it's everywhere. And it shaped the world around us. And that's how it turned into a book.
Okay, so let's go deeper into quarantine. Can you define it? Where does it come from? And
so it's an interesting term, because technically it has quite a narrow definition. So, and often people, even medical professionals, will use it more broadly to mean isolation. But actually, what makes quarantine so interesting is it depends on uncertainty. So the entire point of quarantine is you do not know whether you or someone else is infected or not, or infectious or not. You don't know yet. And quarantine is this sort of buffer, space and time, where you just wait to see if the person is infected or not, or if you are infected or not. You wait until proven safe, which is the title of our book. And so that's the idea of quarantine. Until you know, you just kind of sort of create this little separation. And so isolation is when you know something is dangerous or diseased and you want to separate it. Quarantine is always sort of limited until you find out what the situation is. And the reason it was invented was this idea of wanting to just put that little buffer of safety in there. It was invented in 1377 in Dubrovnik. At the time it was called Ragusa, and it was part of the greater Venetian Empire. Nowadays, I think most people will be familiar with it from Game of Thrones as a filming location. Very beautiful city in Croatia. And totally dependent, you know, its economic lifeblood was trade with the East. And at the time, the Black Death was brand new. In Europe. It had just reached Europe. It had already, historians think, caused huge deaths and outbreaks from across Asia, and it had just made its way through trade to Europe. And Dubrovnik was one of the first places affected because it relied so much on trade with the East. And the city officials were in a dilemma because they didn't want to lock down and not let these merchant ships from the East in, because that's the economic lifeblood of the city. But when they did let the ships and their cargo in, then there were these outbreaks of plague, and it was disaster. So what to do? And so quarantine was this attempt to kind of have their cake and eat it too, to continue to sort of reap all the benefits of trade while not allowing a plague in by saying, hey, and initially it was just a sort of little island offshore. And they said, hey, we're gonna make the ships stop here for 30 days initially. And they called it a Trentina, and wait until we are sure they are proven safe. Later, it became a quarantena, or 40 days, which is where we get the word quarantine from. It's sort of for no particular reason other than 40 days is such a symbolic number in, biblical thought. It's sort of the length of time of a generation, long enough for something to reveal itself traditionally in the Bible, and thus sort of applied to give this new medical practice a sort of a religious grounding.
Yeah, my mother is religious, and she practiced also some kind of religious quarantine. I forgot what it is. So, but yes, of course, it makes sense. Quarantine 40 days, it's got biblical connotations. One thing, when I type in Wikipedia quarantine, I see a picture of a funny doctor with a beak and sunglasses, and I wonder what's up with that. I mean, I can understand the protective gear of nowadays with a mask and all these PPE, but what does the mask and that costume has to do with quarantine?
Yeah, so that's also the cover of our book, is that plague doctor costume with the beak, and it is, like you say, a form of medieval PPE. The spectacles, protecting the eye, the gown and cape sort of protecting the body. The nose is the part that looks the strangest to us today, but it actually served a purpose, and it was stuffed with fresh herbs and sometimes chopped garlic. And it was both a way to, at the time, one of the only things that a doctor could do for someone suffering from the Black Death was sort of lance these big boils full of pus, the buboes that bubonic plague gets its name from. They would sort of stick a knife into them and drain all the pus out. And so it smelled revolting. And so the nose is sort of very practical on that level. The beak stuffed full of things that smell more strongly than this disgusting pus leaking from the bubo you've just launched. It may also, scientists now think, have had some protective effect, because chopped garlic releases an inhalable antibiotic. So it's called allicin, and this is quite recent research. So it turns out that even though it looks ridiculous to the modern eye, it might actually at least have been effective in sort of shielding people from what was otherwise quite a stomach-turning smell, but maybe even protecting their health.
In your book, you mentioned that we find ourselves more dependent we will find ourselves more dependent on quarantine instead of less. So why is it that we cannot pinpoint, I don't know, people who have certain disease, and I don't, I don't know how to explain it, but why are we more reliant on quarantine instead of less? How come we haven't evolved past that?
Yeah, you would think so, right? We have modern medicine, we have, rapid tests. We're so smart these days. Why have we not moved on past this medieval technique? And the fact is we haven't, and we never can. Even at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is sort of the cutting edge R&D lab for the US military, where they're trying to design sort of incredibly rapid tests that will tell if people are infected instantaneously. They still think that quarantine is going to be necessary, and here's why. And there's a few reasons. One, we have been fighting a war with microbes ever since we both evolved. There are more of them. They reproduce faster than us, so they do have an edge, and we're helping them. We are helping them by, first of all, going into environments where they can hop from different species. So we go into caves, we go into, we log rainforests, we create environments where they can mix and hop and become more dangerous. We factory farm, all of these things that give microbes an advantage. And then we travel around the world at increasing pace and in ever larger numbers. And that means that microbes can hopscotch all around the globe with us. And so we are, in the book, and I always hate to say this because it sounds like, prophet of doom, but we are entering, in fact, a new age of pandemics, and with it, a new age of quarantine. When a new disease emerges and you don't yet have a test, and you don't yet have a treatment or a vaccine, all you have is quarantine, and that hasn't changed, and it won't.
In order for a quarantine to work, I believe we need to have strong leadership, and I can assume that the leadership in the United States fell terribly. So I wonder if you could tell us how it fell, and also in comparison, I know that there are some leaders in my notes have Jacinda Ardern or Angela Merkel, who I thought from my perspective, they were good leaders guiding their population through these difficult times.
Well, I'm going to just, it's funny that you cite Jacinda and Angela as two examples, because I did, while researching this book, we went to a lot of pandemic simulations where you kind of role play what is going to happen during a pandemic, and leaders of industry and government are gathered to practice basically and become prepared. And I remember after one of them, the former head of the CDC said to me, I just hope we have a woman in charge when there's the next pandemic. But I would say that I am a woman, but leaving that aside, you're completely right that some places did well and some places didn't, and that the US is one of those places that didn't. And one of the things that was really interesting while we were reporting our book is that for many years we had been talking to the head of the division of quarantine at the CDC. It's a guy called Marty Citron, Dr. Martin Citron. And he had really devoted his career to figuring out, how do you make quarantine work? How do you make it fair? How do you make it just? How do you make it effective? Reforming it, rewriting the legal provisions around it. He'd spent, and training people on it, creating a plan. The US had the plan he had created. He then went and trained other countries on. And we caught up with him during COVID-19 and said, look, what happened, Marty? And I have rarely heard someone sound so crushed. And he said, honestly, politics. The plan he trained people on, he trained South Korea, their response was so much better than ours. It was incredible. It was seen as a role model for the region. And yet the CDC plan that worked really well elsewhere did not work here because it wasn't implemented for political reasons. And he blamed himself for not seeing how huge an impact politics and the kind of leadership in place can have on whether you can implement a plan. It's one thing being prepared, and there's a lot the US still could have done to be better prepared. But if you aren't actually even able to implement the plan you do have, then you're sort of lost without cause. And seeing that, I think was really, for us, even talking to him was just really disheartening to know that we could have done so much better.
But okay, so there is a lack of leadership, but also the American people are unique people. They are the most individualistic people in the world. So do you think the mindset of Jane Wayne or individualistic, I can do it all by myself, versus a more collective society has a lot, regardless of the leader, it's also the population itself. I saw yesterday, as a matter of fact, a guy who made fun of COVID-19 all throughout the pandemic. He was dying of COVID-19, and right before he died, he still was saying that it was a hoax. So how can you fight against that?
That's natural selection right there. Excuse me, but it is. No, it's a really good question. It's something we look at in the book too, because one of the things that we really conclude is you cannot have public health without a public. And if people are divided and they are individualistic, that makes it much harder. It doesn't make it impossible. Now, one of the things we do when we're talking in the book, we have a sort of chapter where we look at the reality of quarantine, the lived experience, the logistics, but also just how it feels emotionally. And we talked to a boredom researcher. So there are actual scientific, university professors who study boredom. And she said, look, one of the things that makes quarantine difficult for people is they don't feel like it's meaningful. And they don't feel like they have a choice. They didn't choose to do it. And for Americans, those things are important. It's less what people will think of you and more you having chosen it and you feeling like it has a purpose. Those are things that motivate Americans. Well, we have psychologists who can help us design experiences that feel meaningful. And honestly, it's very simple to make it feel like you chose something. You give people a choice. People do this with their toddlers all the time. They say, would you like an apple or an orange? And then the toddler, because they chose it, is more likely to eat it. They're still eating fruit. Well, right. Quarantine's the same. Would you like to quarantine at home or would you like to quarantine at this quarantine facility? You're now choosing something. And so there are ways, it's going to sound sort of manipulative, but it's really not. It's like the whole thing of sort of signing people up to make pension contributions because it's easier to just sign people up and have them opt out than the other way around. There's small things that we could do to redesign these public health measures to make them work, even in a country like America, where it's never going to be a situation that in China, we saw these, mass roundups and people being put into quarantine facilities that were, run by the state. And you can imagine that would be tricky to make work here, even though it was actually a more effective response. Like in terms of flattening the curve and preventing transmission, medically much more effective, politically and culturally total non-starter here. But there are ways to at least build in a sense of kind of choice, decision-making, and also a sense of individual purpose into quarantine. And I think that would make it a lot more palatable.
One last question. What can we do to make quarantines better, fairer, more effective, less boring, something that people can jump into it without so much opposition?
It's a great question. And it's the entire last chapter of our book. We have a sort of manifesto for rethinking quarantine. And it's really important that we do it right now because here we are, hopefully emerging from one pandemic. The temptation is just to forget about quarantine and just move on. It's exciting. We're back. We're free again, as it were, Delta variant notwithstanding. But this is precisely the time to actually look at what went wrong and what we can do better from those kind of psychological aspects that I just talked about to even a question of equity. We saw in this lockdown that the people who were hit hardest were often those who had the least resources to manage that situation. And this is something that we can easily think through, figure out how to fix, put those resources in place. There's, ever since the invention of quarantine in Dubrovnik in the 1300s, there have been, there's been an unequal experience, let's put it that way. The rich were able to leave the city, escape, live in luxury. The poor were considered essential workers of their day and exposed to more risk while, making more sacrifices. So we know this. We've been making the same mistake for centuries. There are plenty of ways to to fix this problem. Let's put it in place now. Let's involve people in this discussion now so that quarantine designed better next time. And the other thing is, I think thinking about these things as one size fits all is a mistake, because for some people, quarantining at home and having a plan to do that is perfectly reasonable. For other people who live in very crowded multi-generational homes, it's not. So let's make two let's make up, plans rather than a plan. So plans that work for everyone. One of the things that the head of the American Public Health Association said to us is like, look, we require our stadiums to work as these dual use facilities so that we can use them in case of emergency. Well, what about during a pandemic? That's an emergency. What about for an essential worker who can't shelter in place at home, but doesn't want to infect their elderly parents that they also live with? What about that? Can we build in the ability to sort of flip our architecture during a pandemic, these public spaces that are subsidized with taxpayer money anyway, and have them ready so that we can accommodate people who have different needs and different resources? So I think there's the emotional aspect of it. There's the logistical aspect of it, where it actually happens. And I think more importantly, there's also the communication. We need to talk about this now. I mean, we have made such a horrible mess of so much of our response. And it would just be great for people to look at history, where so many of these mistakes have been made before, and start to learn from them.
Yeah, so just to put a kind of like a negative spin on things, I heard so many reports of a woman being quarantined with their husband who were physically abusing them. So domestic violence is one thing that is difficult to avoid. And the other thing, unfortunately, one of my aunts, she is said to die of COVID, but the real cause of death to my eyes is misinformation. She believed all the lies about why people shouldn't be vaccinated and all this and that. And it just breaks my heart because my aunt is gullible. She believes all the things that people tell her. So we have two victims there, the domestic violence that, if you have to quarantine, you really don't want to quarantine with the husband that is beating you up. And the other thing is, how do we try to prevent people believing in all this misinformation, which is the thing that breaks down any quarantine as well. All this is information, government manipulation, blah, 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 and we shouldn't listen to the health authorities.
I'm so sorry about your aunt. And it is exactly correct. I mean, again, to go back to Marty Citron at the CDC, one of the things he always says is that if the trust account, the public trust, if the trust account is bankrupt, you're screwed. And that's the case in the US. There are a lot of people who do not have trust in authorities, and that's not only their fault. That's also the fault of the authorities, and that's something that desperately needs to be repaired. Because you can't have an effective quarantine without it, as you say. You can't have an effective public health response without it. And I think your aunt, and which I'm so sorry, she's an example of that, and we see it all around us. So absolutely. And as you say, home, for some people, home is a safe space. For some people, it isn't. And that's why quarantine isn't a one size fits all. It shouldn't be a one size fits all. We need to think about people who live very different lives to us and have very different needs, and plan accordingly. And it just planning session after planning session, these pandemic simulations we would go to, people would just say, oh, well, we'll quarantine people, and then they just move on to the next stage in the simulation. But quarantine is an experience that you have to live through, and you have to live through it somewhere, and you still have to pay your bills, and your kids still have to get educated, and you still have to eat, and it's all of these things still have to happen, and so they have to be thought through. Otherwise, it's a mess. We saw that.
Well, Nicola, this is a very timely book, and the way that you wrote it and explained it is extremely engaging. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you?
Yes, absolutely. So it's called Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. And it is co-authored with my husband, Jeff Mano. And you can find, if you'd like to get a little taste of it, first you can find some excerpts of it published at untilprovensafe.com, where you can also find links to buy it. So that's untilprovensafe.com. You can buy anywhere where you normally buy books: Amazon, bookshop.org, your local bookseller, which you should always support. Anywhere you buy a book, there's an audio version if that's your favorite way of taking in books, and so you can get it anywhere. There's also a UK edition if you're listening overseas, Australian. There's a few other places, so you can get this book anywhere, and you can go to untilprovensafe.com to find excerpts, read reviews, see what other people have said. That's probably the best place to find out more.
Nicola, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Stop.